Welcome, everyone, back to the Forum Book Club. We have with us the author of America on Trial, Robert Reilly. We're going to speak with him. I'm not going to go over his illustrious list of accomplishments or his list of illustrious accomplishments. You can find that on the back flap. We're going to judge this book as it is, a thing which is, as Father Shaw would remind us. And there's several questions I know you all have, but I want to start with the first one. I'll turn it over to Vivian and Joseph and Robert himself. But we published another book by you, Robert, called Making Gay Okay. And I see a theme that's common to both these books. In Making Gay Okay, among other things, you contrast Rousseau with Aristotle. Rousseau with the primacy of the will, Aristotle with the primacy of reason, Rousseau with the infinite protectability of man who doesn't have a definition, and Aristotle with man's nature, which is our norm. And likewise in this book, at the origins of our Constitution, you show this dialectic, as it were, between nominalism on the one hand, which rejects natures, and therefore leads to will as the dominant motivation for anything, versus reason, logos, and nature. So, I mean, do you see the culture that has now kind of tried to normalize homosexual relations as related to what's happening in the rejection of our Constitution, saying that it's flawed?
Well, as you know, both books are based on natural law. And so what happens when you neglect or reject natural law? In the first book, The Making Gay Okay, you get this sexual dystopia that infects every aspect of life, which has been manifested in these bizarre Supreme Court decisions, a right to sodomy, a right to homosexual so-called marriage, the right to define yourself in terms of your gender or become something else than what you are through, I guess, surgical assistance. And in the new book, America on Trial, we see that denial of natural law lays the foundation for the exercise of absolute political power. In fact, totalitarian political power for the creation of a Leviathan state, which is what Thomas Hobbes prescribed. And I think it's not too far to say that we see a Leviathan state evolving in the United States now. And the resistance to it is lowered to the extent to which natural law has been lost, because natural law is the standard against which we could judge this Leviathan state as being against the laws of nature and nature's God. You didn't even cut me off there. I really appreciate it.
I know, it's beautiful. It's almost like a periodic thing. Joseph, Vivian, would you like to enter into the dialogue here?
Well, I would like to ask a question. The people that you are contending with in this book, Bob, are scholars of great reputation, who are right about many things, and yet they claim that the American founding was based on Hobbes, who called for this total state, as you just described. And so I have a difficult time squaring the claim that the founding was based on Hobbes with the government that the Constitution actually put into place. However things are turning out now doesn't necessarily mean that the problem started at the beginning. But what can you say about these scholars that you take on very eloquently and respectfully Can you put in a nutshell this thesis of theirs and why you think it's wrong?
Yes, of course, we're speaking of Michael Hanby at the John Paul II Institute here in Washington, and Patrick Deneen at Notre Dame, formerly of Georgetown University. Both very fine men and scholars who have made major contributions. I think particularly of Hanby as a very fine metaphysician. They're right about just about everything except this. They're wrong about the founding. And I think they, like so many people, look at the moral disarray, the moral decline of our society today, and we could all go through the litany of abortion and pornography, broken families, drugs, etc., and wonder, well, how has this happened? What's responsible for it? And they, like a number of other people, say, it was the founding itself because it was contaminated at the beginning with an infection of Enlightenment, radical individualism, held in check for a period of time by the Christianity of the American people. And as the Christian faith has receded, these principles of radical autonomy have taken over and manifested themselves. So they say the founding was a poison pill with a time-release formula, and we're its victims. I go about addressing this in the book in two ways. I examine what evidence there might be for their position, and find it a paucity of evidence. I don't think it's sustainable. But more interesting, and most of the book is taken up with answering, well, if the founding wasn't based on radical individualism, from where did the ideas come? What is the lineage of the ideas that made the American founding conceivable? Who first thought them, and in what context, and how were they developed? And as you know, the answer to that question took me back to the ancient world, to the pre-philosophical world, to the pre-monotheistic world, and certainly to the pre-Christian world, to see what that world looked like without those three things, without monotheism, without philosophy, and without Christ. And then in those three separate ways, how these contributions from ancient classical Athens, from Jerusalem, and from Rome, by which I mean Christianity, fundamentally altered the mindset of mankind and led to the foundation of a new civilization from which eventually, over many centuries, the ideas matured that made the American founding possible. But it also, well, that's a longer story. Let me stop there.
Well, here's something, I guess it's Hanby that places a lot of weight upon Madison and Federalist 10 and claims that really the purpose of the American founding was to maximize individual diversity and therefore maximize autonomy and freedom in that sense. And you make very clear that that's not what the founders had in mind. It's not what their documents verify, because of the basis in natural law that we have a norm that's outside politics, to which politics must adhere. But I wonder, is there some possible kind of middle ground here to say that because the Constitution and the Declaration speaks primarily of the individual and the state, with not speaking directly about intermediate social entities, the family, doesn't mention the family, it has right of association and so on, but is it possible that there was kind of a lacuna, not a flaw, but a failure to incorporate in the Constitution the institution of the family, the pre-political unit of society, that therefore it kind of had a vacuum there, which this individualism would eventually fill. I don't know. I'm not maybe seeing it too clearly, but
No, well, first of all, you're speaking of Patrick Deneen, not Hanby.
I'm sorry.
In
Okay, yeah.
respect to Federalist 10. And as to your larger question, I don't think so. First of all, we have to remember that the American founding and the Constitution allowed for dual sovereignty, federal and state. And family issues were solidly within the purview of the state. Family law was in the states, and the federal law had absolutely no business saying one thing or another about the family. The Constitution, certainly in its preamble, speaks of justice and the common good. The Federalist Papers talk about the common good as justice is the end of government. I mean, this was very much part of the conversation, as was, of course, by all the founders, the requirement of virtue for the success of this kind of republic. And that the foundation of virtue, or its source, was to be found in religion. A unanimous view of the founders, even by the few theists in it.
So what?
So there is, I don't think that you will find a lacuna there.
Okay, so what in the founding documents and the founders themselves is a preventative that should have prevented this movement towards radical autonomy, which we see now as so dominant, and especially the Kennedy decision in Casey versus Planned Parenthood. Could there have been something in the Constitution more that would have prevented this from happening?
Well, look at the decisions. One thing I did for that book I wrote for you against the homosexual marriage idea gave me, as perhaps the most painful part of the research, the obligation to read all the Supreme Court decisions, as well as the federal decisions and some state court decisions regarding the issue. The paucity of philosophical thinking in the minds of these jurists was the single most shocking thing to me, and that they made statements for which they would have gotten an F in any freshman philosophy course. So when Justice Anthony Kennedy creates out of whole cloth this, and he used the term individual autonomy, that appears in no founding document. It doesn't appear in the Constitution. It's not in the Declaration. Where did it come from? It came from his disordered mind.
Well, his view of liberty, I mean, he bases it on, at the heart of liberty, he says, is the right to define one's own concept of meaning. Well, once you've said that, there's no natural law anymore.
That's right. That's a notion of liberty that would have been completely foreign to any of the founding fathers, because the meaning of the universe had already been decided and was within the laws of nature and of nature's God. You didn't get to make that up. You had the obligation to conform your own will to, as Father Schall and Plato said, to what is. And what is, that is, the laws of nature, tell you what is morally good and what is evil, what is just and what is unjust. And you are not at liberty to make those things up. You are at liberty to find your way to conforming your will to the truth of these things. So the Justice Kennedy decision has no foundation, and unfortunately there were enough other justices to reach a majority decision in that case, as there was in the Obergefell decision allowing for homosexual marriage, and so forth. Now, the difference here is that Patrick Deneen looks at these decisions and says, well, yes, I mean, Justice Kennedy was right. I mean, I'm presuming he would say this. I don't have a quote from Deneen saying this. Yeah, he's right. That's what was in the American founding, were this radical individual autonomy, which was an Enlightenment principle, you see. And therefore, it's more or less inevitable that such a decision would eventuate from that principle. Now, my counter to that is that, no, he just made it up. There is no foundation in the founder's thought or in any founding document that would allow for that, would allow for an understanding of liberty to mean that you were free of the moral law. I mean, Thomas Jefferson made a very famous statement in his Notes of Virginia saying the people, sovereignty resides in the people, allowing them to basically do anything under the moral law.
Right. I don't think that Kennedy made it up entirely in the sense that he's downstream of culture. And our culture become more hedonistic with the sexual revolution. And so this gave birth to the idea of the living Constitution, that we have to try and interpret the Constitution in the way we think the founders would think today if they were under our cultural circumstances, So that's...
Well, I think you're right. And you have to look at the decline in legal education and education as a whole, along with the other, the decline in the general culture. But here is what is explicit in the founders' thought, and said so wonderfully by John Adams.
He's an amazing... I'm glad you quote him so often. He really is someone that is illuminating in what he says.
He makes very clear, as do others, that the truths on which they are basing the American founding, these truths are transcendent. And as transcendent, they are immutable. In fact, he'll say as immutable as human nature. So you have immutable transcendent truths, the things that are true everywhere at all times for everyone. And you have a nature that is steady, that doesn't change. Those are the two necessary presuppositions for the American founding and what they constructed in the kind of republic that they did. Now, if you disavow the fact that these truths are immutable, the ship goes down. And in fact, people will deny that human nature is immutable and that it can be shaped. And in fact, that it's the obligation of the Leviathan state to reshape it, to either make it more manageable or to bring it to a state of perfection that they make up from according to their own criteria. If I can, I'd just like to jump to give a quick illustration of the product of this kind of thinking, and it's toward the end of the book. And I quote President Barack Obama from his book called The Audacity of Hope. So here it is. Quote, implicit in the Constitution's structure and the very idea of ordered liberty was a rejection of absolute truth. The rejection of the infallibility of any idea or ideology or theology or ism and any tyrannical consistency that might lock future generations into a single unalterable course. Well, of course, it was the whole purpose the Constitution to lock the American people in a single, largely unalterable course, with, of course, the provision of allowing for amendments to meet the exigencies of circumstances that would arise in the future. Excuse me. So here, when you have a president of the United States denying the principles of the United States, you know we're in serious trouble, and that the erosion, the intellectual and moral erosion, has gone very deeply indeed, to the extent to which it's no exaggeration to say that the survival of our republic is at great risk today.
Yes, you had a quote from Wilson somewhere too. I'm trying to find it here, where Wilson had something quite similar to say. Joseph Pierce, we've gone over 15 minutes without hearing from you. This has set a new record, which will probably never be equaled, and certainly not surpassed.
Well, I'm always into breaking records. I'm pleased to be a record breaker here. I've been just part of the silence, and Robert, what I would say is I was amongst the triumvirate that do this book club, The Skeptic, at the beginning. And I first of all would like to congratulate you on a masterful job as regards taking the evidence, looking at both sides, and presenting what you've done. And I'm I was not opposed. I was ignorant and perhaps had the arrogance of ignorance. But I'm pleased to have some solid foundation on which to base the founding now. But that being said, because I just think it might be fun to play devil's advocate, I am, after all, the immigrant in the room. That I did feel that, and do feel up to a point, that the founding of the United States is based upon the Enlightenment principles. And you've done a very good job at showing that covers a multifarious range of beliefs, and there's a world of difference between Locke and Hobbes, for instance. A masterful job. But let me just maybe make an analogy here. It seems that the Catholic Church always has an ongoing battle in every generation between orthodoxy and modernism. And modernism basically thinks that the church should move with the world, and orthodoxy says no, that the church should move the world, to paraphrase Chesterton. Of course, the church believes it's founded on the infallible presence of Jesus Christ. The United States does not make that claim, obviously. So if that's the case, to what extent and in what foundation does the founding have a right to defend itself from the sort of modernism which we see being practiced now? Why shouldn't America move with the times in accordance with whether the prevailing zeitgeist is? We know why the church can't, because it's obviously contradicting. Now, you're going to give me the founding documents, and that's great, and that's what you've done extremely well. But I'd like you to do that, though. I mean, as I said, I'm playing devil's advocate. I'm not the devil, So, if I was to say, look, so the church is founded on Jesus Christ, right? Who, if you're a Christian, is God. The United States is not founded on that. It's founded on principles of natural law. In what way does that, or can that, protect the United States in a sort of orthodox way? What sort of orthodoxy can the United States proclaim to defend itself against the modernism of the zeitgeist?
Well, thank you, Joseph. I think that those philosophical principles announced in the Declaration, for instance, that all men are created equal, and that they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, the right to life, liberty, etc. Now, either that's true or it's not. There's no in between. Now, what can happen is that people can say that and give it a completely different interpretation by changing the meaning of the words. And this has been done most especially in respect to the meaning of equality, as we see today and in what's happening in the streets of America, equality has taken on a different meaning. And what I would suggest is the reason this has been is that there's been an underlying change in the metaphysics of it. You know, the founders had a realist epistemology.
Robert might have frozen, Father.
I could have, but maybe he just stopped speaking.
Did you not hear me? Was I lost there?
That's all right.
You were standing very still for a while if you weren't lost.
That was
you're
just
back now.
It was just a period. You know, that's a period. Vivian, have you been waiting to say something, Vivian?
No, not especially, but I think Joseph's question is an important one in that how do we turn this around in the direction it needs to go? We're seeing such a momentum here with homosexual so-called marriage, with these violent riots in our streets, making demands of equality and liberty and so on that are not in keeping with the founders' metaphysics. And so I think the question that a lot of people end up having is, well, what on earth can we do to reassert the transcendent truths that are now being denied?
Could I actually have an addendum to your question before we hand it over to Robert? Because actually, you end your book on an extremely hopeful note, which I've even suggested is triumphalistic, which actually I have no problem with triumphalism. That Logos wins in the end. So, we're talking about, there's all sorts of demonic powers out there. They're very powerful. But your final sentence in the book is Logos wins in the end. I mean, what do you mean by that, and why?
I mean by that the universe really does have a rational structure to it that we call natural law. That structure was in place there by the Logos. That it is immutable, and that the denial of it cannot, in the long run, be sustained because there's nothing really holding it up. So, the denial of reality can only last for a certain period of time. It will be defeated by reality. The question, however, remains, how much damage is it going to do before it is defeated? And what we can do is see what are the grounds upon which we can say something is right and something is wrong, and spell out those grounds as we do say what's right, what's wrong. And of course, one aid that ought to be by our side throughout this struggle is the church. And one wonders where its voice often is in this matter. By the way, if I just give a quick reflection on what has been going on, not simply in the streets with the rioters and the Antifa fascists, but during the lockdowns in response to the virus, I would say that the virus is helping make the response to the virus in certain states is helping to make very clear what the features of the Leviathan state are. For instance, in the Commonwealth of Virginia, the governor assumed something close to absolute power in being able to define what was essential and therefore could continue to take place, and what was non-essential and therefore could not. I'm sure it'll be no surprise to you that going to church or synagogue, that was non-essential activity. and therefore prohibited by the state. However, abortion was an essential activity and therefore had to continue. Thus spake Leviathan. And one can almost see which governors are enjoying flexing the power that they have assumed under this role. I even had a conversation, at least email exchange with the great philosopher at Catholic University, Monsignor Robert Sokolovsky. And we were talking about Leviathan. And he said, yes, of course, Leviathan tells us where we can go and when and with whom, but it also makes us faceless through its requirements that we wear these masks. We come more and more to observe, look like the subjects of Leviathan depicted on the frontispiece of Hobbes's Leviathan when it was published, when all of the subjects who constitute Leviathan's body are faced into him, looking up to him, and faceless. You can't see their faces, and they exist only insofar as they are part of Leviathan. And this, of course, is a reversion to the pre-Christian state, the pre-philosophical state, and indeed the pre-Jewish people. And we are witnessing today in the streets a retribalization of man, because identity politics is precisely retribalization, which takes from people the ability, first given within philosophy, to recognize another person as a human being, which is a universal. That's the primary thing about them, not whether they're black or brown or white, or what their genitalia are, or what they think they are. And that is taking us away from, and in fact is an explicit denial of, the founding principles of the United States. And it's why the statues are coming down, why the Lincoln Memorial is defaced, why Jefferson's coming down, why General Grant's statue is toppled. It's because the principles themselves, which are represented by these great and noble men, have been denied.
And so the answer to Joseph's question, the one answer to this that would give us hope, first of all, to realize that we have that hero-lasting city, and despite all the benefits we've received in this country from our Constitution and our founders, America has no mandate to last until the Perusia, so it may disappear in its present form. And what can we do to preserve the good things which this country has provided for us in the world? And there's two very direct and simple things. Those of you listening or watching who are not celibate should have as many children as you can. And you should make sure you educate them not only in the faith, but in the principles of good government and justice. And if we can do that, we will have an increasing number of people who are well-educated, well-formed, both philosophically and in their faith. And then in a democracy, which can tend to corruption, because when people realize they can vote themselves more benefits from the government, then the government that gives more benefits is going to win. So there's an internal flaw in democracy itself, maybe not a flaw, but a tendency to make government the provider in place of oneself. In any event, having good marriages, faithful until death, fruitful, open to life, and then educate them with logos, true logos, that's the answer. And if we don't prevail, well, we've done what we can, and we can face our Lord with a clean conscience.
Father, yes. Can I add to that? That's all completely true. But the other part of the picture, the other side of it, which is as positive is logos wins in the end, is that pride precedes a fall. As I think that what Robert Reilly is saying there, but pride precedes a fall. When you give these people enough rope, they hang themselves. The only question is how many of us do they hang before they hang themselves? But they are hanging themselves.
If I could make, first of all, of course, I agree with everything my publisher just said. I would like to add that here's my reflection on what I see in the streets. First of all, Christians share the belief that we're all sinners, that we're in need of penance, that there is no prospect at all of our perfecting ourselves, that we could only reach perfection through the mercy and grace of Jesus Christ, who is our Savior. We don't save ourselves, He does, and we act in cooperation with the grace He gives us. By the way, this was the almost universal view in the American colonies at the time of the American founding. Now, what I think I observe in the behavior in the streets is people who think they should already be perfect, and the fact that they're not is somebody else's fault or some institution's fault. And therefore, they take out their grievance on these other people or these institutions as they expect self-perfection or perfection as the state of nature in which they are, because they're untouched by original sin, you know? So that's antithetical. In that, I'd say they're the inheritors of the French Revolution, which was premised on the perfectibility of man and took as its primary enemy in reaching its goal the church, which is why it tried to destroy the church, and why it's no mistake that we have seen some of these people in the street attacking, burning Catholic churches, taking down the statues of our saints, and desecrating a statue of Mary. It makes perfect logic because the church is the primary obstacle to their achieving their utopian fantasies.
You've given me, Bob, a great segue into next week's book club discussion, because I'm kind of almost sad to conclude our discussion of America on Trial. It's been so fruitful, and your presence has made it even more fruitful. But next week, we're going to begin discussing The Next Pope by George Weigel. And he's precisely addressing this question, Bob, of what we need in the next Pope precisely in order to combat this decline we're seeing and this moral decline, and so that the church will, in fact, not be drawn along and submerged in the surrounding culture, but actually can resist, swim upstream, so to speak, and maintain these truths, which, as you say, are objective and transcendent. So next week, how much do we cover of this, Joseph?
Half the book. We only have 2 weeks.
So half the book. So the first half for next week. Robert, thank you for being with us. Thanks for writing this book. And we really appreciate this opportunity to discuss it with you. So until next week, everyone, God bless you. Goodbye.